welcome everybody today to the National Day of Action for Forgotten Australians. Over 10 years ago, on the 30th of August 2014, the National Senate report on the inquiry into more than 500,000 Australians who experienced institutional or out-of-home care as children in the last century was tabled in Parliament. That Senate report identified us as forgotten Australians because of the years of silence and disbelief that we have encountered in seeking justice for the harm and the crimes committed against us as children. Many forgotten Australians were abused physically, sexually, emotionally, and deprived of love and affection. Many were denied access to health care, dental care, and a decent education. For many, our childhood was one of hard work, deprivation and neglect. For many, the trauma of our childhoods has had a profound, lifelong impact on us, our families and our significant others.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. Over 10 years ago, the Forgotten Australian report tabled in Parliament made 39 recommendations. The first of these recommendations was a national apology to forgotten Australians who had suffered harmful abuse and neglect while in care. It took 5 years to achieve the national apology given by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2009. That apology acknowledged the neglect and abuse many experienced during our time in the care of churches, charities and state governments. The Forgotten Australian report also made strong recommendations that in addition to a formal apology, other positive measures were needed by governments to acknowledge the harm suffered by forgotten Australians as children, so that the apologies were not regarded as merely empty gestures. Examples given of such positive measures included reparation and redress schemes to make amends for wrongdoing, injustices, injuries sustained, and to rectify as much as possible the damage inflicted on our lives. Now, 10 years later, and 5 years since the national apology, we're still waiting for many of those 39 recommendations to be implemented. For most forgotten Australians, the apology has become an empty gesture that's meaningless in the daily suffering still endured by so many that are no better off because the government said sorry. So let us now focus on some of those important recommendations that have been ignored for the past decade. Recommendation 6 was that the Commonwealth Government establish and manage a national reparations and redress scheme for victims of abuse in institutions and other out-of-home care settings. Recommendation 6 has been completely ignored. Today, 10 years later, on this National Day of Action, we remind the federal government that we are still waiting for them to establish and manage a national reparations fund for victims of abuse in institutions and out-of-home care placements. Not all Australian states have introduced any sort of redress at all, while Queensland, Tasmania and Western Australian governments have directly addressed the issue. New South Wales has not conducted any inquiries into past abuse of children in their state care, nor established any redress schemes. New South Wales is arguably the worst state of all for past and ongoing abuse of vulnerable children in care, because New South Wales has stolen more children by far than any other and has now made forced adoptions legal and a priority for children in care. When you're dealing with such rogue states like New South Wales and others, it's very important that the national governance be established in accordance with Recommendation 6. Recommendation 8 was that the Commonwealth Government establish an external complaints review mechanism, such as a National Commissioner for Children and Young People, who would have the power to investigate and mediate complaints by those dissatisfied with church processes, review the operations of church-sponsored complaint mechanisms to enhance accountability and transparency, and report annually to the Parliament on the operation of the Church's complaint schemes, including data on the number and nature of the complaints. Well, just last year, the position of National Commissioner was created 9 years after it was recommended by former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who appointed Megan Mitchell to that position. The great tragedy in the creation of the National Children's Commissioner last year is that the most important part of the recommendation was completely ignored. This position is only one of advocacy, with no power to investigate the abuse of forgotten Australians or the ongoing abuse of children in care now. Then when you examine the work history of the current National Children's Commissioner, you discover that she was the former Executive Director for Out-of-Home Care for Docs New South Wales. A position like that is one that is very complicit in covering up abuse and deaths of children in care. At the time, Julia Gillard hailed this appointment as a significant step in the protection of children in Australia. Sorry, Julia, but without investigative and prosecutorial powers, the National Commissioner is not protecting children, or any of us who are forgotten Australians, and is nothing more than a well-paid bureaucrat. So there remains no transparency or accountability for the childhoods that any of us suffered. Recommendation 9 was that the Church and agencies publish comprehensive data on all abuse complaints received to date, and then subsequently on an annual basis, and that this information was to include the number and types of complaints received, the number of church or agency personnel involved in complaints and allegations, and amounts of compensations made by the complainants. And then recommendation 10 was that this information be provided annually to the National Commissioner for publication. So recommendations 9 and 10 have been completely ignored, and there remains no transparency or accountability for the religious or other organisations and agencies, past or present, that profiteered from forgotten Australians and children currently in out-of-home care, as no such data has ever been published. Recommendation 11 was for the Commonwealth Government to establish a way to require all charitable and church-run institutions and out-of-home care facilities to open their files and their premises and provide full cooperation to authorities to investigate the nature and extent within these institutions of criminal physical assault, including assault that led to death, criminal sexual assault, and to establish and report on concealment of past criminal practices or of persons known or suspected or alleged to have committed crimes against children in their care by the relevant authorities. Then, if full cooperation was not received, and it hasn't been, and full access was not allowed, and it hasn't been, and this investigation failed within 6 months of this report, which was tabled over 10 years ago, the Commonwealth Government, in consultation with the state and territory governments, was to consider establishing a royal commission into state, charitable and church-run institutions and out-of-home care during the last century. So today, nationwide on this National Day of Action, a decade after it was recommended, we call on the federal government to grant a royal commission into the abuse of forgotten Australians. This royal commission must include all forms of abuse and torture we suffered as children, including, but not limited to, the nature and extent of physical assaults and assaults that led to the deaths of children murdered in care, sexual assault and systemic rape when children were forced to undergo invasive procedures that involved their genitals, experimentation on children in institutions such as drug trials for medications like Depo-Provera and vaccinations like polio and whooping cough, skin graft experimentations and electric shock treatment. An investigation is required into whether payment or donations were received by the institutions involved that forced these human experimentation projects on the vulnerable children placed in their care. Also, it needs to cover areas of neglect of dental, medical and allied health care, child slave labour in places such as farms and laundries who profiteer, lack of formal education and preparation for life outside of the institution, separation of siblings and denial of contact with other family members, children that remain buried in unmarked graves, loss of identity and family, extreme psychological and emotional abuse, torture and religious brainwashing, poor quality and quantity of food that impeded childhood development and limited future potential, the high rate of suicides for forgotten Australians both as children and in later years due to the damage inflicted upon us in childhood, resulting for many in a lifelong struggle to exist, endure and survive. We need a full investigation into the cover-up by the church organisations, charities and state governments of all those who have committed crimes against children in their care. All crimes against children that breach the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Australia promoted its humanity to the rest of the world as one of 8 nations involved in drafting the Universal Human Rights and overseeing the global adaptation of universal human rights in 1948. Yet in practice, our governments have continued to ignore and breach the human rights of forgotten Australians in the 66 years since the UN Declaration was made. If a country is judged on how it treats its children in their care, Australia has well and truly failed as a nation, and today is a day of shame. So in accordance with Recommendation 11, made over a decade ago, we request a royal commission into all forms of abuse and torture suffered by forgotten Australians. The pink bats and the unions didn't have to wait 10 years, so why do we? Recommendation 13, that all government and non-government agencies immediately cease the practice of destroying records relating to those who have been in care. Sadly, this illegal practice of destruction of records has never stopped and it continues today. Recommendation 19 was that the Commonwealth-funded National Conference of Service Providers and Advocacy and Support Groups, with the aim being to establish a professional national support and advocacy body for forgotten Australians, and that this body be funded by the Commonwealth and state governments and the churches and agencies. That has not happened. 10 years later, we still do not have a national professional support and advocacy body for forgotten Australians. And this is urgently needed because there's many policies that need to be developed. Not least is that we are getting older and we are facing our final years, and I'm pretty sure none of us want to end up back in institutional care. Recommendation 20 dealt specifically with ongoing funding to CLAN, Care Leavers Australia. So what about the rest of us forgotten Australians, who are the vast majority and have received nothing by way of help and support or funding? Even the relatively few forgotten Australians that have approached CLAN for help report they had received nothing more than an annual bill for membership. CLAN does not represent the majority of forgotten Australians, so today we speak around the nation with one voice for ourselves. Recommendation 22. That all state government funded services be available to all care leavers in the respective state, irrespective of where the care leaver was institutionalised, and that funding provisions be arranged through the Community and Disability Services Ministerial Council. Many of us no longer reside in the states in which we were institutionalised or in other forms of out-of-home care. And regardless of where we now live, we should not continue to be disadvantaged. This is a national problem and needs a national solution, as put forward in Recommendation 22 over 10 years ago, and it needs to happen now. Recommendation 33 was that the Commonwealth and states submit through the Council of Australian Governments to implement a whole-of-government approach to the provision of programs and services for care leavers across policy areas such as health, housing, welfare, community services and other relevant policy areas. So recommendation 33, which remains ignored a decade after being tabled in Parliament, is more vital now than ever as we shine a spotlight on the current deplorable situation of the lives of many forgotten Australian survivors facing their final years of life. Poor health and a lack of affordable housing are two big issues for many forgotten Australian survivors right now on a daily basis. Many are living in rooming houses, bed sits, caravans, cars and homeless on the street with no available resources to deal with the ongoing permanent physical, emotional and psychological damages they have sustained from a childhood of abuse and torture in the care of church and state during the 20th century. A very high number of forgotten Australians have a poor quality of life today. Many had no way of coping with the outside world after a childhood of institutional living. Many were poorly educated, and thrown onto the streets alone and with nothing as they aged out of care to fend for themselves in a world they did not know or understand. The government has a duty of care to provide adequate medical and dental care now because they failed in their duty of care to forgotten Australians throughout their childhood, resulting in current ongoing health and dental problems. So today, around the nation, we are calling for recommendation 33 to be implemented as a matter of priority after 10 years of waiting for action. We request a health and dental card that includes community services for all forgotten Australians that will provide us with health and dental care and prioritise forgotten Australians for housing and other community services as needed. It's taken many years of fighting to expose the childhood abuse and torture by so many forgotten Australians. And finally, 10 years after our suffering was acknowledged in the Forgotten Australians Senate report, and finally, 5 years ago, we got an apology and another obvious empty promise that the remaining recommendations made 10 years ago would be supported and implemented. Yet here we are, 10 years later, 5 years after the apology, and still waiting, still fighting for justice and restitution, still forgotten and ignored by the federal government that seems to be using the strategy of waiting for all of us to die, as so many already have along the way. Saying sorry is meaningless, it's an empty gesture, as outlined in the Forgotten Australians report tabled 10 years ago. We're not going away, and we will fight on for justice, particularly for those forgotten Australians most in need of support who are not able to speak out for themselves. The governments of Australia have failed us just as they are failing the current children in out-of-home care. They've learnt nothing from our years of suffering and are repeating the systemic failures that devastated our lives. They are selling the current generation of stolen children to our past abusers. Current abuse and deaths of children in care are still being covered up, and until there is real accountability and real transparency, nothing will change and consecutive governments will continue to fail vulnerable children. These remaining recommendations must be implemented as a matter of urgency to help those whose lives have been destroyed by systemic failures and horrific abuse by those formerly held in high esteem by our community. Righting the wrongs of the past is long overdue, and it is well and truly time for the Australian government to take responsibility for the crimes of the past and provide forgotten Australian survivors with some decent relief in the remaining years of our life.
Yeah!